Board members, please come back to the table. We've got to get started. All right, thank you all for quieting down. That helps us a lot. So thank you all for waiting. We do have overflow space in the cafeteria where they're able to hear what's going on, I think, right? And see audio and video. Thank you very much to staff for setting that up. We had more people come out than we anticipated, obviously, and we've been trying to scramble to make sure that everybody has a chance to see. And we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to hear as well. So unlike in our board meetings that we have at Luther Jackson Middle School, it's really hard to do our business in here with any level of noise. And so if everyone could please cooperate. If you find that it's hard for you to do that, please feel free to go to the cafeteria. But it would help. You know, we came here to do business, and people came here to see what we're going to say and do, and so it's going to be important for us all to honor that. Thank you very much. So Mr. Plattenberg and Mr. Smith are here to get us started. I will just a quick introduction of what we're doing for anyone who's not aware. The board's purpose tonight is to continue our discussion of proposed updates to Boundary Policy 8130. No vote will be taken tonight. The current review of the boundary policy is part of an overall strategy to address growth in the county and overcrowding in several schools. The school board has been reviewing Policy 8130 to ensure equity and effectiveness when considering school boundaries. Any potential boundary adjustment will be discussed and decided through a transparent process that engages the community. So, Mr. Plattenberg, are you going to start us off? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity this evening to talk about our continued discussion on the goals and the prioritization of the factors for the boundary policy and the review of draft policy 8130. As I said, this is a continuation. I'll go through briefly where we have come from. In October of 2018, we reviewed the common practices for boundary changes. In February of 2019, we reviewed the educational research on boundary and related FCPS practice. On March 2019, the school board provided guidance on the goals for boundary policy and also to prioritize factors included in the boundary policy. This evening, we're continuing our discussion on these goals and the prioritization of the factors, and also to review draft policy 8130. A review of the discussion, we presented the survey of prevailing practices around school boundaries. Staff did an exhaustive research across the nation and identified the common threads of what most school divisions had provided. We presented a matrix of other districts compared to FCPS. And then we also presented the educational research findings on factors commonly used by divisions in boundary decisions. In the review of the discussion, the educational research findings showed that 8 of the 16 factors commonly used by school divisions in boundary decisions have the potential to impact equity and excellence for students. These factors are geographic proximity, transportation, cohorts or split feeders, demographics, health and safety of students, socioeconomics, current or projected school capacity, and achievement. The draft boundary policy highlights in Section 4 of the draft policy, we identified the reasons for boundary adjustments. We identified reasons that may require revision of school boundaries, which would be capacity, surplus or deficit of an existing school, equitable access to educational opportunities, opening of a new school, closing of a new school, alleviation of attendance islands, or natural disaster. In Section 6 of the draft policy, considerations governing establishment of school boundaries, schools identified with a reason for boundary adjustment shall, adhering to the One Fairfax policy, have a variety of elements examined, including socioeconomic and or racial composition of students in effective schools, the geographic location of effective schools in relationship to the surrounding student population, walking and busing routes, operational efficiency to include long-range capital plans and busing costs, and avoid the creation, again, of attendance islands. Section 8 of the draft policy, 8130, administrative boundary adjustments, maintains administrative boundary adjustments and revises the administrative boundary adjustments as an option. Specifically, in Section 8 of the draft policy, the administrative boundary adjustments continued. The current policy referenced that the superintendent would be authorized to administratively adjust school attendance areas after consultation with effective school board representatives when any one of the following circumstances occurred: an emergency or other overriding public need requiring such change, New unoccupied housing requiring reassignment to avoid school overcrowding to facilitate student transportation. Less than 5% of the enrolled of each school being affected, and analysis indicating the change would improve the operating efficiency of the school division. The draft policy included the division superintendent shall recommend annually to the school board to adjust school boundaries and program boundaries in response to an existing boundary being misaligned with a geographic feature. For example, we have some technical elements. Excuse me, I think I just advanced. No, I didn't. Did I? No. We have some technical elements where we've had elementary schools. Hayfield Elementary School in Lowe's Island is the latest one that comes to mind, where we had a cul-de-sac that was halfway developed. The boundary for that during that development was half went to Lowe's Island, the other half went to Hayfield Elementary, but since there was nobody built on the other half, nobody went there. So, Island Creek, I apologize, thank you. So what happened was when the developer then got permitting to approve the development, we saw that as a technical element, and that is what this refers to. All right, the next one, Section 8, again, eliminates expedited boundary adjustments, eliminates the expedited boundary adjustments option in order for all boundary decisions to have the same approach for transparency purposes. In Section 9 of Draft Policy 8130, student continuity, revising phases of implementation, aka the grandfathering, to mirror the Regulation 2230, the student transfer process, allowing students in their final year of elementary, middle, and high school, we call it senior status, to request to remain at their current school. It provides more immediate impact on school capacity, surplus, and deficit. Board follow-up action, the recommendation is to approve the draft policy in 8130 to include revisions to reasons for boundary studies, factors to consider in boundary studies, removal of expedited boundary adjustments, and changes to student continuity. The board follow-up action, really this is a fluid element, is providing the proposed timeline of the recommendation of approval of a draft policy, 8130 in September of this year. However, as you heard this evening, you'll recall during FPAC's presentation, they recommended some form of bringing in some kind of consultant conversation. So again, this is just the follow-up action of the timeline we had, December 2019, incorporating the priority recommended boundary adjustments in the draft capital improvement program. That's staff's recommendation initially on the conversation, where we've been, how we've gotten to where we are, the number of meetings that we've had, and we're certainly open to any questions and conversation that you have at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Plattenberg. Thank you for being so brief. That's helpful. I have Mr. Moon and then Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Thank you, Mr. Plattenberg, for the presentation. Since I only have 3 minutes, let me ask you a couple of questions first and see how your answers may go. And depending upon your answers, I may have follow-up questions. Going to the slide number 5, one of the reasons for the boundary adjustments is equitable access to educational opportunities. I think I sent in this question over the weekend for the superintendent to anticipate that I'll be asking this question on Monday. That the superintendent responded to me that possibly you could share with us some examples of what those might be. So if you could at this point, share what those examples could be.
Yeah, Mr. Moon, you raised a very good question when you asked about the equitable access to educational opportunities. That component was included to ensure the broader consideration of individual student needs that could be addressed through the provision of resources such as programs, a physical plant, capacity, and staff to address that. And one of the examples that we provided, that are providing, is that if there are many students in a particular neighborhood choosing to transfer for an academic program, let's say, for example, an IB program, the policy would allow the school board to initiate a boundary change in order to accommodate that program for the available school assignment. So that's just one example that, for example, if you have students that in one region that are transferring out for an IB program, that the board can consider a boundary change to make that the base school to have that IB offering for the majority of those students.
So that's not necessarily boundary change, but that is a program change for the particular school.
You could do a program change, but I'm talking specifically about a boundary change. I'm not talking about taking an IB program at an existing school and putting it at another school that may have an AP program currently.
So
I'm talking about the students that may be attending The
So
board
are you saying that between school A and school B, B offers something that A does not, and certain subdivision in A, you see a lot of students going to taking advantage of a program in B. So are you saying that that may trigger boundary change for the particular subdivision to go over to the other school? Is that
It could
what
be,
your?
it's for the board to consider. It's something that the board could consider for the potential for a boundary change. That could be one, yes.
Any other example you can give?
Not at this time. Perhaps, Ms. Gillis, do you have any other ideas?
So we did also talk about other programs, whether it be special programs for special education, if there are large numbers of students who were residing in a particular area, and rather than place that program in a different school, you could adjust the boundary. Once you considered the cost, the transportation, that would be part of that possible boundary adjustment. So that would be a possible reason for an adjustment.
Yeah, at least I think I understand what you are saying, but I'm not sold on that idea as for being a legitimate reason for boundary change as opposed to programmatic adjustments between schools. So I need to have a little more time to think about, where I'll wait to hear from, rest of my colleagues on that point.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra, to be followed by Ms. Strauss.
Thank you, Mr. Plattenberg. And I appreciate in your presentation on page 2, you go through how we got where we are today. There has been a discussion in October, February, March, and now July, and you specifically mark it as a continuation of a discussion on goals and prioritization of factors. So I think that's important since there are a number of community members here, and certainly I have, among other people, have received a great deal of mail that would suggest that that process has not happened, but this is a continuation of that discussion. So you mentioned the FPAC recommendation that there be an outside consultant of some sort to help us to analyze how we deal with this. I'd like to hear your comments on the pros and cons of that proposal, and then whether there might be some concerned area. Well, I'll let you answer that question, and then I'll ask my second question.
Well, thank you very much. I'll tell you that this process, like many things that have been undertaken by this governing body, have been pretty daunting a task, like later high school start times. And when the collective body has gone ahead and done the work, setting that blueprint for change, initiating that action, staff, you have the best in practice staff that are sought after not only through the region, but also nationally for programs that we have and things we implement here in Fairfax County. In fact, that's one of the reasons that we are so proud of our whole school system. That being said, I think the comment somebody said that staff has the lens of trying to accommodate what, through these work sessions, the governing body's desires would be, which are reflective of the community. So when we go through that process and we put these things together and we kind of develop these drafts, certainly it is a school board policy. If the school board feels that bringing in an outside body would benefit, absolutely. Staff doesn't have any problem with that whatsoever. We do our best work, and then we're certainly open to any scrutiny, much like our internal auditor and the processes that we've established with that. You would say, what would the cons be? Okay? Those are the pros. The cons I would advantage and I would suggest to you would be making sure that we articulate what the desire of the governing body is for the consultant to do. If it is to take a look at the national landscape, to take a look at the community aspects, and to come back and then provide recommendations in each of these areas through a transparent process, then that could be definitely beneficial. However, I think clarifying and providing the right framework, I think, would be absolutely imperative. That's all I have.
Thank you. I still have a little more time. So I agree with respect to clarifying that purpose. It might be quite helpful. I was trying to get more toward, and you may not have a comment on this, but I was trying to get more toward whether you might find that process of getting outside support helpful to staff. We can address that. I'll just go through the rest of my questions. The other concern I have is making sure that we're communicating through the process so that, you know, I see you outlined how, you know, how we've gone through this process since October of 2018, but going forward, there's a great deal of interest in this. It always is. This is the third rail for school boards. So certainly we want to have something clarified as to what exactly we were doing. And then if there were that type of delay, how might the staff assist us in addressing some things that may need more immediate attention? A couple of names come to mind. We don't have to go into specifics today, but I would certainly be concerned about some of the issues that the public has brought to my attention and how we might be able to address those while we are seeking this outside clarification. My overall concern is, as I read some of the research that was the basis of what we are talking about today, the research did not seem to be as focused on the concerns that we are talking about as a board. I mean, one of them was, you know, what the impact of desegregation was. I mean, well, we're a little bit past that, right? I don't know how relevant that is to where we are today. And so I don't think that some of the research that we saw really speaks to the concerns that we've expressed and that you expressed in your presentation.
Yeah, in reviewing what you've suggested, I think overall it's the dynamics of this process have been something that's been an evolution. So I think that's going to continue. When we take a look at our process, our CIP process, the Capital Improvement Program is an annual review of a 5-year projection. It's done annually based upon the demographic works by the director, Ms. Jessica Gillis, and her staff, based upon September 30th enrollment each and every year. So we can see how things are growing. There are certain parts of the region that are growing, and that CIP addresses potential options of how to address that. I think that while this body of work is about, we have an existing school board policy. We have, as staff, a practice, and we are going through, I call it page 46, which was basically our marching orders in the CIP document, which is available online. We also have hard copies, that you can see what was approved for us to do in terms of looking at boundary adjustments. It also speaks to the boundary adjustment process and the communication with the public, which is a fully transparent process, about the scoping, about going back out, having the public meetings, having the public input. In my past experience of boundary adjustments that we've been through, the elected officials attend those meetings and are very cognizant of what the community desire would be. And I can tell you that staff may look at things and say, where I grew up in the West Springfield community, well, Lake Atkinson might be a natural, the creek might be a natural barrier, and therefore everything on this side should be a boundary. So when staff takes a look at these things and we look at technical boundary elements, say I-66, staff will make a recommendation. But through the public process, members of communities identify, well, our children are aligned with these children right here. This is a whole low-lying floodplain that we may have missed. So that process generally results in a hybrid, not what staff recommended, but usually with the community process and the feedback with staff's recommendation for the board to consider for the boundary adjustment, including the grandfathering. So I think basically we would continue with the current process in the interim. That would be how I would see it moving forward while the board reviews, gets the feedback they want, and proceeds down the road about this update.
Janie Strauss, followed by Ms. Derna Kofax.
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate the very first bullet
on slide 5, where a reason for looking at a boundary adjustment is capacity surplus or deficit of an existing school. I think everybody here is quite aware that I have a poster child for that at the moment, where we need to not take anybody out of Langley High School. We need to add students. And McLean High School desperately needs relief. So I appreciate that capacity adjustment is very important, particularly if there is a deficit within a matter of a few miles. That certainly suggests taking a look at that. I would also hope going forward with my colleagues, we have in the past have had a very open and transparent boundary policy. Everyone is at the table for every boundary adjustment, and I would certainly hope that we would continue such a process. It is important that we are able to crunch our numbers, and I very much appreciate, and again, I've said this before, on our CIP and in the various tools that we use now for counting student enrollment, month by month, grade by grade, class by class, and that is a public part of the CIP document as well as the dashboard, so that everyone can watch the trends and can see how students are counted, because it is that student count and the trends that are very, very important. Also, the school board in the last year or two, we've spent a lot of time talking about community schools, the importance of building community around a school, and that it is important that the children, the families, their usual activities are part of the community support that are important for children. So again, a lot of those discussions come to light in great detail when we discuss with the community if there are going to be any changes. So again, I appreciate this. I listen to my colleagues, but again, I very much support opening a boundary when we have an overcrowded school, particularly when it's right next to a very much under-enrolled school. I think that's fair to the taxpayer, it's fair to the students, and it's fair to the community, particularly when it has no negative impact at all at any current students or any other boundaries that might be involved. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Derenak-Kofax, followed by Mrs. Schultz. And I want to thank board members for sticking to the 3-minute limit. That is helpful. We've had a lot of people waiting, and we're trying to run through our comments as efficiently as possible.
All right, Mr. Plattenberg, Mr. Smith, Ms. Gellis, thank you for all the work you've done to get us to this point today. Mr. Plattenberg, you know you have an amazing staff, but they are small, and they are taxed often. And so Ms. Keys-Gamarra asked the questions, and you provided some answers that I was talking about. When we spoke to FPAC earlier tonight, I would be a board member that would support the recommendation of the FPAC committee to take the data, develop boundary solution options from what we have, where you guys have given us an excellent starting point, beyond a starting point. But I think it would help us, as Ms. Hogan and her team said, to develop what-if scenarios. I think that's very important. I think courageous conversations will have to take place as to what other factors may come into play when we talk about boundaries. We have to look at best practices nationally. We have to go through, I don't want to steal Ms. Corbett Sanders' thunder, but she'll talk about the research. There was a long time ago the last time we did a full boundary study. And I'm sure you'll talk about the numbers and the times and we were a much different county then, much smaller, many, many years ago. And so what we have to do is when we look at this, I think having an outside organization, I think you have a commitment from this board. I think there was some miscommunication out there tonight as to what decisions were being made. This is, as we said many times, a work session where we're continuing a discussion that began in 2018. And when we start developing more exact steps, these will come to the fuller community. These will be discussed. People will understand what's happening. We're not saying it's going to be easy conversations, but there will be a discussion amongst our community members so you have a real understanding what is happening. So that's my 3 minutes at this point. And again, just saying that I would support having an outside organization help us as we walk down the road in this process.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Schultz to be followed by Ms. Evans.
Well, I guess it's going to be no surprise that my comments are going to be entirely different. I feel like we've completely glossed over why we're here tonight. You can look at if we could bring up the slide on the number 2 on how we got here. We seem to have skipped a few steps. You know, we said we want to look at boundaries to what happened with getting something into our agenda tonight. We have a governance committee that works on policy. I don't even know how this policy was developed. There was a massive rewrite of this policy that stripped out stripped out.
I'm going to stop your time, Ms. Schultz. I want you to have plenty of time to say what you want to say, and those interruptions are making it hard. So if everyone could just hold your applause and your comments until Ms. Schultz is finished.
Yes,
Thank you.
we shouldn't know what the public thinks.
I'm just trying to protect your time, Mrs. Schultz.
Look, the bottom line is there was a wholesale rewrite of a boundary policy. I don't know who did it. It's supposed to be our governance committee. Entire portions of the policy have disappeared, like our expedited, that I was on the last board where we put that together to help address these problems so that they don't balloon, so that we're not looming this ghost, this specter of a county-wide boundary policy that Arlington is going through that is a disaster for the homeowners there. I think we're in a situation where I've asked previously if we could please go to what we skipped over very significantly, slide 6. I have asked the legality of deciding to change a boundary based on a child's social, economic, or racial composition or characteristics. I think we used to do that in the past and we got rid of that. And so the notion that we would identify a child or the neighborhood that a child lives in and target them for a boundary change based on the color of their skin or the size of their parents' bank account is a frightening prospect on legality alone, considering the amount of legal issues this board has. I don't even understand why we're going here and not presenting. What's being presented to us is changing a boundary for a program placement. I mean, that's honestly, that's an absurd statement. If a child or a community needs a program, it's up to us. We're not supposed to outsource the work of 28,000 employees and 12 board members to an outside consultant. So I do think this is experimentation. I don't think it's fair to the community. This is how processes get made. If we waited to let the board, the public know about this until it was all done, there's no chance for them to have a voice. So, you know, I really want the staff to comment on how you eliminated whole sections that were supposed to be around expediting to be fair, and how we're going to effectively do this without a legal challenge from, you know, entire sections of our communities to say it's not fair to target children this way.
Okay, thank you very much. I have Ms. Evans.
No, I'm sorry, I just asked staff 2 questions. I would
I'm
like a
sorry. I
response.
apologize. Go ahead.
One thing I want to share, Ms. Schultz, I'm glad the community cares about boundaries. Listen, this is one of the biggest issues school districts deal with. And when I got here, I recognized that there had been very few boundary changes that have been made in a long, long time in Fairfax County. I came here in the county over 25 years ago. I came here over 25 years ago when I became a teacher in the Herndon area, and I watched boundary processes go through. And we need the community to feel in the loop and feel transparency. One of the proposals, remember, as Mr. Plattenberg said, our existing policy remains in effect until the board makes a decision in policy. We've spent multiple work sessions sharing with you best practices, and at the last one was direction to move forward and bring you a draft of our collective best thinking, and that's what this is. One of the things this expedited boundary process involved, in my view, less, not more transparency, because it was a single board member and a superintendent making decisions for a community. You saw Mr. Plattenberg reference in fact, we have that slide, it was 5% or less. Well, 5% or less is based on the certain numbers at the time, and then it becomes a justification for another set of boundary decisions that can be made. So we're taking that out to increase, not decrease, public transparency so that the entire board has the opportunity and the community to know what is going on when boundary decisions are made, and I think that's what we need to do. Section 6, I want to clarify just your assessment. My assessment of Section 6 is these are considerations governing the establishment of school boundaries when schools are identified with the reason for boundary adjustments, and there's a separate section that talks about what would initiate that, with capacity being the first factor on that section. So I think as we studied best practices, many school districts use a host of factors once they've looked at boundary decisions, and again, capacity has been the overriding factor in school districts. But once they've done that, they begin to look at a host of other factors, including socioeconomic and racial composition, geographic location, walking and busing routes, operational efficiency, and the creation of attendance islands. So this is really that second layer to make sure we're looking at all these pieces which matter to kids, which matter to parents, which matter to our community. So I look forward to the continued discussion with the board, and I think it's important to listen to the community. I think it's also important that we listen to each other so that we can come forward with a way forward. Fairfax County continues to grow, and we're going to have to figure out the way forward to make decisions around how we're going to handle that growth. We've been trying to build our way out of it, and we have a 37-year backlog in our CIP. We've been underfunded for years. I do applaud the Board of Supervisors in my first year and working with this board. Many of you in your advocacy helped get an additional $25 million to begin to accelerate the queue. But we have a host of issues, as the FPAC folks said, that we need to tackle head on, and I'm confident working together we can do it in a collaborative manner that's going to be what's best for Fairfax County Public Schools.
I would like a go back afterwards.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. We now have Ms. Evans to be followed by Ms. Corbett Sanders, and we will give you a go back, Mrs. Schultz.
Thank you for that explanation. And Mr. Plattenberg, thank you so much for all of your work on this. I know boundary issues are very, very difficult. On my first round, and I know I'm going to need a second one, I'd like to focus on slide 4. And I did send these questions. If you don't have the definitive answer tonight, believe me, I will understand. But my question here is, you've looked at the educational research on what factors lead to equity and excellence for students, which I think, has to be our top priority as a school district. So if you look at these 8 factors, and I have to admit I'm a little confused about number 8, with achievement affecting excellence. I'm not sure what what that means. But I wanted to ask you, and again, Mr. Plattenberg, I know there's a lot of educational research here, but what of these 8 has the strongest impact when you're talking about creating a school environment that provides for equity and excellence for our students?
Yeah, this research was the research that came out of Orsi's office.
Okay.
And perhaps, Mr. Smith, I don't know if you recall exactly what the leading one was that came out of the 16 that she provided in the 8.
Well, in going back to the previous presentations to the board, we recognized that capacity was the overriding. There were the 3 of capacity. The next was the socioeconomic.
Well, excuse me, I'm sorry, but capacity isn't up there.
If you're
When we're talking about the 6, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mr. Smith, but, okay, so you said capacity is the first, and then socioeconomics is the second?
Capacity was the first, and then socioeconomic balance based on the research was the second that the research showed. And then the third was travel times for students in terms of having an impact on students, an educational impact on students. And so as we created this particular policy, we looked at some of the factors that we could place into reasons for a boundary change, and then we looked at those considerations that the board and the community would want to consider once a boundary change was decided upon. So that's how we've bifurcated the reasons for a change along with those considerations that individuals would think about as we would look at what that boundary would look like.
So I'm looking, and could someone explain to me achievement and excellence, because it says the factors that, I mean, where are you differentiating? How are you defining excellence if it's not by achievement? And I'm not trying to trip anybody up here. I'm just trying to understand what we're saying impacts the boundary decisions. If we're looking at what makes for a school with equity and excellence, and we're looking at what impacts equity and excellence, I guess I'll give you, perhaps this is a follow-up then, or maybe a next step. I would like more clarity on how these things impact. I mean, you have answered my question. You know, you're saying that capacity issues. So you're saying that the biggest factor is, in terms of equity and excellence, is whether a school is over or under capacity?
Well, initially we looked at those factors that had an educational impact, and so those were the 3 areas that had the greatest educational impact on students.
Okay. All right.
Ms. Evans, if, maybe what we should do is have the underlying Orsi report resent to the board so that we can all, it's a good question, and I think it goes back to an earlier meeting, and so we may need to refresh our memory about that report.
It does, and Ms. Gill has just reminded me, if I may, Mr. Smith, that was question 283 that was responded for previously. I'll just read it real quickly so for clarification, and I'm sure there'll be follow-ons that we'll have to provide in addition. Mm-hmm. The Office of Research and Strategic Improvements Review of Educational Research related to boundary changes uncovered 4 ways in which boundary decisions may be linked to achievement: through student diversity, student well-being, social connections, critical for success, and overcrowding concerns. Mm-hmm. Three of these four areas, student diversity, student well-being, overcrowding, offered sufficiently clear evidence to support the 3 conclusions in the presentation. More specifically, address overcrowding by first utilizing existing building capacity, balance student diversity, socioeconomic. This was also tied to program placement, as research evidence supported the link between program placement and the diversity of students at schools, and then minimize travel time, which was linked to sleep and student well-being. And then it says, for more details, see the response to health and safety concerns related to travel time in the above response. But this was response number 283 to a previous question. And if that doesn't address yours, please, in the next steps, provide additional so we can have staff review and have ORC provide a response.
Okay, and I think you've been generous with my time, so I'll just ask for a go back.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. Ms. Corbett Sanders, followed by Ms. Palchik.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Gillis and Mr. Plattenberg, for your work on this. This has been and continues to be a challenge for this board to really unpack as to how we should proceed. And so I wanted to put some of this in context. The last time that we really looked at boundaries holistically in Fairfax County goes back to the mid-'80s, as I understand, like 35 years ago. And at that time, there were 122,000 students in our schools. We now have 188,000 students in our schools, and we continue to grow. Our population in Fairfax County was 661,000 people. We now have twice that. And so it really is something that good governance requires policymakers to look at things and see how we can better meet the needs of our community and to be most effective in how we manage not only resources, but most importantly, ensuring that we have great outcomes for all of our students. And so I do welcome that you all have done the work you have. I do want to know a bit about what you expect as far as the impact on our schools and on our communities, because from what I can tell from a planning process, and I do welcome what Ms. Schultz introduced earlier with the CPDC, is greater collaboration on the planning activities with the Board of Supervisors, because from what I understand, we expect significant growth in the Dulles corridor, in the Tysons area, along the Route 1 corridor, which will result in exponential growth in our schools. And so from your perspective, do you think it is healthy for a board to review its boundary policies on a more periodic basis than every 35 years?
Absolutely, but as exhibited by the interest, it's always a very, very compelling discussion through the communities to make sure that you capture what the community wants in your policy, what the board wants as their vision in the policy. That being said, you are correct. We do have growth areas across this county. When I believe it was said earlier that this county was supposedly thought to be built out at one time. Well, I've been a part of all of these revisionings and all these redevelopments. The county does communicate with us in trying to determine the projections, which we've had work sessions on, and proffer formulas, which we've had work sessions on. But to your point, with those changes, absolutely, I think it would be incumbent to periodically review, and perhaps that's something, if you do bring in some outside lens on this, perhaps that's also something that you could define for them to look at. What would be inappropriate? The work I do internationally on behalf of the United States Department of State, some of the questions I am asked are, how do we look at a master's facilities plan? What is the best practice? As I've got advanced certificate in facilities planning, I apply those same tenets when you look at the periodic review of these things. But again, it's a board policy, that's a governance issue. I don't disagree. We do have a board process where policies are to be brought back before the body for review on a more periodic basis. And should the school board choose to take a deeper dive, as you suggest, staff wouldn't be opposed to that.
So if we were to bring in an outside consultant to help us with this, to help staff with this, do you expect that the role of that outside consultant would be to help us engage with the community? Because there seems to be a bit of a disconnect that people don't feel like we have let people know about what we're doing and provided the opportunity to have the broader community provide their insights into the overarching policy associated with boundaries?
I think that's a healthy advantage. Yes, I mean, that's certainly up to the governing body to consider.
Thank you. I will listen to the rest of my colleagues and perhaps have a go back.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wilson, to be followed by Ms. Palchik.
Thank you, Ms. Hines, and Thank you, Mr. Plattenberg, for this presentation. I want to touch on a couple of things that I don't think we've addressed so far. But first, I want to get to something that Dr. Brabrand mentioned, because, and others have mentioned as well, is the notion that Fairfax County is continuing to grow. But in this year's CIP, the 5-year projection for growth from the numbers presented were 0.2% growth. And so I wonder whether you could talk about that. Is that no longer correct? Are we really expecting a flat population of students, or are we really projecting much more growth now than since December of last year?
Well, Mr. Wilson, that's a great question, because our growth, albeit from one year to the next, we have said it's been contracting. We look at birth to kindergarten ratio, right? How many children were born 5 years ago versus how many showed up. We look at our transfers in, new students never attending schools in Fairfax County Public Schools versus our transfers out. We've had a lot more migration by different groups, and it's broken down in our capital improvement program, as I said, that's linked on the website and articulates each of those components that we look at and the trends that we forecast. But you raise a good point. We do see a continuance of growth, but at a contracted level. What does that mean? Well, what that means is we don't think the growth is going to be as huge as it's been in the past, simply put. That being said, that's why we look at it on an annualized basis. When you have a group, when you have the technology quarter, when you have 10,000 units that have already been approved for zoning and have permitted, the resultant effect downstream is impact on schools and boundaries and communities. And so, yeah, I think realistically, if there was a total ability to communicate and articulate everything that goes on in these processes, I think not only would we be having the active discussion we're having this evening and the participation from the community, but it would be through the process of the zoning and new development and new growth, because that's where the meat is. That's where the future forecast that comes down the road that impacts schools. So, but yeah, there's a lot going on. It was mentioned before by Ms. Corbett Sanders, the growth in the Route 1 area. All of these things are going to have, the shift and the change is going to happen, as it has since the 80s.
Okay, and I don't mean to pick on you on this a little bit, but in the policy that I assume staff prepared, since I don't know that any board member was involved in the almost complete 100% redrafting of the boundary policy, in section 7, it says the board is committed to the use of long-range planning techniques to minimize the necessity of frequent boundary changes. Your CIP says no growth basically for the next 5 years. Here you're telling us that, but with the developments out in the Dulles corridor, maybe we're going to have big growth. How do we engage in long-range planning techniques with that?
Well, two good questions, right, Mr. Wilson? The point about it is, if you take a look at the McLean-Tysons area, there were approximately 9 buildings, dwellings, tenant buildings, that were supposed to result in huge impacts on our schools. Well, when that original forecast came out from the planning department, that was forecast to be done by now. It's not all done by now. A lot of economic drivers impact those things. That's why we take a look at it annually. When it was originally zoned and planned for, the zoning and planning was for different type of dwelling. When the development got to the final permitting and final approval for the zoning, they changed the dwelling based upon market research, which had a resultant negative impact in terms of our student yield for us. So we look at those things on an annualized basis, as I said, to see what that growth trend would be, when the impacts are going to come. People talk about Amazon and the impact on us. Well, what people didn't understand when we spoke with our colleagues at the county is the demographers and planners had planned growth for something to come that would have an impact on that portion of the communities that would serve, even if it's going into Arlington. There was growth and development in the Springfield areas and some of these other areas of growth and development that would accommodate something that would come. So when we talk to them about, is this an additive impact, staff's professional comments and responses back to us were, no, not unless we see something other than we had forecast.
Okay,
I hope that answers your question.
I think, well, I mean, I'm not sure it does, but just to confirm, then you don't see population growth, or maybe I've got that backwards. Maybe you do see population growth.
I see it exactly as it's reflected in the CIP, but I do warn, I grew up in this community. I was here when it was 122,000 students. I've seen the shift happen. I've seen when schools have been closed because there's been midterm contractions, and that some of those decisions, I'm not judging, may appear as premature. So therefore, when there's a contraction, you have to take a look at the 5-year outlook. A forecast beyond 3 years is challenging at best. I'd be doing something else other than school children forecasting if I was better at that. And then your annual review is what is the key. We have some, and one of the members who's not here this evening in her district, that had been stagnant for an extended period of time and is now showing an uptick of young kids in the school. And it had been since she's been on this board. So that's the best answer I got for you, Ms. Wilson.
Okay. Well, the other question, which I don't think I got answered, was how the language of this was developed. I don't know whether or not the folks who are here tonight can
Correct.
see, but it's
Right.
it's entirely rewritten.
Yeah, and that was the purpose of having the red line in there so that everybody could see what was done. What had happened through each of these work sessions, so people understand, when we had gone through the initial boundary policy conversation, in each of these work sessions, there was a difference of a change, of a shift of the direction of where staff was going. First of all, staff was basically of the opinion, this is board's policy. And the answer back, rightly so, was yes, but staff, you have to provide us with some context, some recommendations. What is your best recommendation as staff? So staff came back and identified some things, and then the questions came back as, please give us additional clarification. Okay, what's everybody else doing? Thus the reason why Ms. Gillis went ahead and did across the country of some 26 different comparative school divisions and identified the big matrix and chart, and if people want to go back and look at those work sessions, you can see all the work because it was posted online. Then there was, what's the research say? Then the Office of Research and Statistics had to do their bit and go do their part and came back with their report. And then the last school board meeting we had, the work session rather, it was directed that staff come back with a draft policy. I say directed, I'll say consensus. Staff came back with the draft policy to comprehensively incorporate the best practices, the research that was out there, to take a look at, because the conversation around the one Fairfax lens and those comments and all those things, to incorporate them in this document. Some of the documents, some people have said to me, well, you know, hey, you redlined out under the previous number 9, number 6, implementing considerations, and you call it considerations, number 6, considerations governing establishing school boundaries. Well, you took out the impact on neighborhood school feeder alignments, the distribution of programs, resources, overall impact on families and students, and the comparative long-term cost. Adjustments shall. And you put in, when boundary changes are being considered by the school board, the changes shall not be restricted by the boundaries of individual schools, administrative areas, zip codes, and magisterial districts. And they'll say, why did you do that? Because this language was rather vague as it pertained to item E. And what was item E? Item E was that we avoid the creation of attendance islands. Okay? So to make it more tight, more comprehensive in that component, staff made those changes. That's why you have the red line, so that the board, individually and collectively, can review staff's work. Again, this is going to be the board's policy. Staff's trying to assist and provide. At the end of the day, if staff just didn't get it or is way off, this policy will be reflective of the governing body and that of the community, I believe.
Okay, well, I got to reiterate Mr. Moon's reticence in saying I'm not sold on one of the reasons being equitable access to educational opportunities. The example you gave was pretty light. The prior language said boundary changes in order to maintain or improve operating efficiency and or instructional effectiveness. That's a lot clearer. That's a lot easier for me to understand. I hate to be too critical, but this is a lot of red ink for something that we can't understand.
Well, Mr. Wilson, I would just say, none of these changes will happen without the board voting on it, so there's always opportunities to offer amendments. So thank you for that. Ms. Palchik, to be followed by me, I think, unless somebody wants a turn who hasn't had one.
Like a go back, though.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate you clarifying that, Mr. Plattenberg, and for your question, Mr. Wilson. I do think it's important that we realize that we're here because we're reviewing an existing policy, correct? We do that as a board. This is a policy, as Ms. Corbett-Sanders says, that has not been reviewed in many years. And especially while we may not have even growth, and especially because we don't have even growth in our county, and because we are seeing, especially in my district currently, many of my middle school, high schools, and I think across the county, if you look at our middle schools and high schools, are at or above capacity and still projected to be at or above capacity, and several of our elementary schools. So I do think I understand, right? Boundaries are going to always be a challenging conversation, and I think we're doing our best to have that conversation. We did ask staff to look at this policy, and I appreciate you taking a look at it and bringing it back to us. Personally, I don't think this is something that should go to a small governance committee of 4 people of the board. I think this is a conversation that needs to be at the level of our whole board, and we need to continue to have it at this board level. So I would not, unless we're at the point when we're just looking at, final tweaks, would not recommend sending it back to a smaller committee with actually less ability for community input. I guess just 2 things I think that haven't been shared yet. One, or clarified, because we've been through this process, but many people here and watching may not have been following it as closely, is when we talk about the factors, and I appreciate that you mentioned that we're looking from the research at the factors that most have impact on educational impact, because that's quite a bit that I've heard from the community. What about the educational impact? So you have shared that from your research, it is those 3 factors about capacity, balance, diversity, and also the distance, the time spent on buses. Can you share for me briefly, currently in our current policy, how many factors are considered and how those are prioritized when boundary changes need to occur and how we make those decisions?
Okay, well, the current policy, really, it talks about those factors, but it's not really prioritized. So it has, and that was one of the things I think Mr. Moon had mentioned, that the board had struggled with in the past, and therefore they came up with those and put them in there, so there would be considerations. It's like what Mr. Wilson said about operational efficiency. Well, it's in the new policy, it's just in a different place. It's for considerations. This board may feel that it needs to have more of the other language again, like that was. I wasn't presenting or responsible. My mentor was at the time that the last policy was done, and I can understand, given the feedback and communication, the need to have some of those things articulated that may not be codified in terms of a weighted element. But that was what was in the previous policy.
Okay, thank you. So essentially, in the previous policy, those were not as transparent. They were not decided by the elected board, and essentially, in some ways, had to be kind of looked at a case-by-case basis, and I believe in a less transparent manner. So I think it's important we have that conversation about what those factors are when we're looking at a boundary, because I've gone through boundary changes, and it's always a question, right, that comes from the community. How are you going to scope and decide the new boundary for a new school or a boundary change? And then, so I think it's important we do that. I also agree with Dr. Brabrand that the expedited change was not transparent, so I appreciate we're doing that. I may do a go back. But finally, I think the biggest thing that we do need to think about, we do have a process for community input. We have a current one. I think we need to think about how we can improve that and change that as we go forward, and our ability to outreach, especially to our communities who maybe don't have as easy access to what we're discussing today. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McAvey.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Plattenberg, for bringing us this. I do want to just speak briefly to something you had raised earlier, which was the start time change process, and I do believe that's probably the biggest accomplishment of this board in the past decade. And I think, as many of us witnessed, what was effective about that was the change management process that we used throughout that. And I think the discussion that's been taking place about bringing in professionals to help us with this process, and it is an important one, and it's something that I support. What we saw with the start times process was that bringing in professionals who have the subject matter knowledge that we can pair with our public engagement process was particularly effective. And in the end, although not everyone agreed with us, they at least felt heard in the process. So I support my colleagues who agree with that approach, and hopefully it can bolster our public engagement efforts.
All right, thank you, everybody. I will take my first turn, and then we have several go-backs. Thank you very much to staff for taking this on. We know we're not only here because it's been a long time since we looked at our policy, but also because our policy basically was just a list. And when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, and we've kind of bitten off that hard work. So I do want to thank staff very much for this work. I think it's very important that you did it because we rely on your expertise for this. Anyway, sorry, I'll keep going. I have notes, but I can't even read them. Sorry. I would say some of the frustrations that I'm hearing from the community are folks in those sort of hotspots, and we have one right near me, and that is the McLean-Langley hotspot, right, where we have a school, McLean High School, that is significantly over-enrolled with 13 trailers, and we're going in and taking out we now have 18 trailers, thank you. We're taking out the lockers in the hallways because with that many trailers, you just don't have space in the building for all those kids. And right next door, we have a high school, Langley, which is significantly under-enrolled, right? Not only is that a problem for our students and families at McLean, it's a problem when we go to the community and the Board of Supervisors and say, we need more money for facilities, and they say, but you're not doing obvious things, right? Why should we give you money for brick and mortar and all kinds of additions at McLean when you've got room right next door? So I think what I'm really hoping is that we continue to have this conversation, but I've been telling people in the community who have a specific concern, let's wait, we're not going to do anything about it until we finish this higher level policy conversation. And I feel like at this point, almost a year later, we need to move on some of those hotspots. We really do. And I personally think McLean is one of them. I would support that. And I don't want, I'm not against the idea of an outside expert, that's fine, but I would not want that either to slow down what needs to happen at these spots like McLean. So, I would say, maybe this is getting to what something Ms. Keys-Gamarra said. We've been at this for almost a year, and the history goes back further than that. So it might be helpful, and I'm tasking staff with something, and I'm sorry we keep doing that to you. But if we published a report that pulled together our boundary conversation since October 18th, just all in one place, and then also give some of the history, that sort of got us here and how we've spent many, many years just throwing trailers in the backyard and not really dealing with, or spending money on additions that we were not spending on long-term maintenance and renovations. And, so that's kind of how we got here. And I would just say so the question that I have is whether we can maybe do that for the community as we move forward. But also, if you don't mind giving us just a little primer for everybody on sort of how we did get here in this priority conversation about building new space versus trailers versus making a boundary adjustment. We have been choosing the first two because it's hard to do boundary adjustments. But what are the opportunity costs of doing it the way we've been doing it rather than boundary adjustments?
Well, that's a really intricate question. How are we doing it? Well, as a school division, we had done it based upon the growth and the overcrowding. When you take a look at Lee High School, when Lee High School had the students that were future West Springfield High School students, and they had triple shifts, split shifts, and they came up with the school name, the mascot, and the school colors during one lunch break. And then when they went ahead and built West Springfield High School, and West Springfield High School was getting overcrowded and it was having split shifts, and the overcrowding shared lockers and athletics and everything like that was trying to work around while they were building Lake Braddock Secondary School. So how have we done it? We've always been chasing the tail, like the conversation that you heard from FPAC, like the conversation that we've had before about the average lifespan of our facilities and the inefficient costs of deferred maintenance in the long term, all of the reports that I've provided that over the years. Recognizing that working together with our counterparts at the Board of Supervisors, we have made progress. We have increased our capital funding. We have provided alternative solutions. We're more creative than ever. the community school conversation through the successful Children and Youth Policy Team and the expansion. We have provided the opportunity for the space within our buildings. It's come down to staffing and what services and what region. So we've made progress in terms of evolving on how we are addressing it. However, we have been building additions. This previous board had the conversation, and some members of this body, about what's the best size of a high school. And if you recall, we never got to the size of the high schools that we have right now, that we are building additions to. So what did we do? We went ahead and we took a look at the opportunity cost of all of those components, the land cost. The most recent one that we're looking at is close to $2 million an acre in a region that we're hoping we're going to get some help. When you take a look at some of those things that would, when we have a limited capital improvement program budget annually that we can spend, and we're spending it on renovations, and why are the renovations costing so much? Because contrary to what my mentor had been doing with paint and patch and carpet, because it was all new construction, we are investing in the arteries, the mechanical, the electrical, the boiler. I have schools, West Springfield was an example, before the renovation began and just after, we had the phasing of when the boilers, when the mechanical systems, when the chiller would need to be replaced, and that summer before school was out, the chiller went down, and the cost of leasing a chiller to maintain that school being active was cost prohibitive. But we had to do it because of the scenario I just described. So we've been building additions and building additions. And when we went in and did renovations, and we built additional capacity, it was for the unforeseeable growth, not to the extent that Langley has, but Langley is one example of that as well. So that's how we had addressed this problem over time, because it would be perfect to say we can just buy a new property and build on it, or we can just buy an old office building and convert it. We are looking at any possible quiver in our quill that we can possibly use to be the most efficient and effective with the dollar limitations that we have. And that's why we've had feedback through our joint processes by the governing board of supervisors that it's not just where we have capacity and where we don't, and just busing kids all across the county. Because we've said we don't have the capacity to do that, number one. Number two, I mean, I'm running 80 bus drivers short each and every day, so we can't impose something that's untenable operationally. So working together with the board of supervisors, we've had those conversations about how we're going to collectively do this in the future, and that it isn't just redistricting that's going to get us out of this issue. It's the comprehensive approach through a fully transparent process of looking at redistricting, looking at capacity, looking at right-sizing our facilities, program offerings, and everything else. Okay. And as a result, hopefully, your policy will reflect all of that in its final form.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Plattenberg. It's very complex. I appreciate your giving that, to helping us out with that. So go backs, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, followed by Mrs. Schultz, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I do want to make one comment, because I think Ms. Schultz made his comment that this should have gone through the governance committee. I'm on the governance committee, and, you know, we just don't have the staff to do it without the use of staff. So we would have been going through the same process. I get what you're saying in terms of the integration and board input, but correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Plattenberg, is some of this driven, or the changes that you have made driven by the comments that you received in our various work sessions prior to now?
Absolutely.
Okay, that is what I was assuming. So I know we've had a great deal of difficulty, Ms. Evans and I trying, and others, Megan and Mr. Wilson, of trying to get things done on the governance committee, because we just, we don't have the staff to do it. I mean, we can send it to staff, but it's a lot of legwork that we ourselves. Right, well, you can, 1 second, I'll go on, because my time is ticking. So the second thing I want to do, and I agree with some of my colleagues, I agree with Ms. Hines, my second part that I was trying to get to, and then I ran out of time, was we do need to identify what those hotspots are. As Dr. Braybrand mentioned previously, the way that we dealt with some of these things was not as transparent as this board has identified we'd like to deal with things. We have that opportunity now to deal with it in a more transparent way. I would completely support that. But it took a little wrangling to get here. It took some of this ugly process to kind of get here. It did, sometimes the making of sausage isn't fun, but it tastes wonderful. So, or at least in my opinion, it does. Depends on what kind it is. But I think we're at that point. If this board believes that we do need to get that outside and consulted, I would support that. But I would also support having a session where we identify those areas that need more immediate attention so that we can have an open and transparent discussion about that.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I just want to make reference to page 137 in the CIP was an attempt at exactly doing that, where it shows the Fairfax County Comprehensive Plan development centers. So what we've done is we've tried to make this document comprehensive, very user-friendly, so that people can see what we're talking about and why. But excellent point that you make about continuing that conversation. We've had the county come brief at your request, so.
Thank you. Yeah, the CIP has improved significantly in my time on the board, so thank you to staff and FPAC for that. Ms. Schultz, followed by Ms. Evans.
I'm glad the CIP has improved. I think that's probably been one of my top priorities, right, Mr. Plattenberg? Look, I appreciate the staff is taxed, but the public is taxed, and they're taxed a lot more. And frankly, that's what this comes down to, the question of how did this all get started? And the notion is that we're making boundaries based on something called equity. I have asked over and over again, what's the definition of equity? And it's never been given to me as what this board is calling equity in terms of anything. It changes based on whatever the topic of the day is. And equity of a different sort is a phrase that I've used endlessly. What about children who are dragged far from their base school to a distant school because of a boundary? And that's not been addressed. And to be perfectly honest, Dr. Brabrand, you said that that everything is in the policy remains in place. It does not. You stopped doing something that is in the policy, and this board stopped it. We could have been solving problems for the last 2 years with our expedited boundary policy, and that was very transparent because it identified a path to have communications with communities to solve these small problems so that we were working all along instead of accumulating problems to the point that now something is being talked about, a county-wide boundary study. We don't have a county boundary-wide problem. We have a problem at McLean. I have 129% or 37% or whatever it is at Centerville. There are specific schools that have specific problems, and those problems should be solved as we go along. We should not be talking things like the Fairfax County School Board shouldn't cover the bets of homeowners. That's an inappropriate role for this board. People buy their homes where they buy their homes, where they buy their homes, and if we need to do moderate boundary changes along the way, and the previous board to this one constituted the expedited boundary policy, it shouldn't take staff digging to response 283. How is that transparent for the public? So I continue to struggle on something that should be very simple, that if there's a discrete problem, we should be solving discrete problems along the way. This is not a problem that you solve on the backs of children, is dragging children or depriving children of access to programs. We decide where the programs are placed. We decide where the boundaries are. And I'm going to ask that we do not consider outsourcing this to some third party that we can hang the responsibility on when this is all done.
Okay, Ms. Evans, to be followed by Mr. Moon.
Thank you. So I'm glad we're on this slide because I wanted to talk about what prompts a boundary change. Mr. Plattenberg, have we ever had a boundary change due to a natural disaster? Yes. When did we have well, okay, so when Dogwood burned, yes, we rebuilt that, but did that?
We did have a temporary while we rebuilt it, yes. But that's a perfect example that you bring that up. So it can occur.
Is that the only time you're aware of the?
That's the only time I'm aware of.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I'm just
Balmoral was split because you couldn't access the front and the back, and so the front of Balmoral goes to Centerville and the back goes to Robinson. So that was a natural, I mean, that's a natural,
That's not a disaster, though. This
Well-
says natural disaster. And so the only one I was aware of was Dogwood burning down, and I think it reopened with the same boundary, did it not? When it reopened? We didn't change the boundary. So I'm wondering if, you know, if because a school closed, when it burned down, it closed. So I'm not sure that natural disasters
Because we
really-
decided to rebuild it. Yeah, correct. I mean,
So-
that could be a predicated thing.
Right. So going to the second one here with the equitable access. The point I was going to make, and it's along the lines of what Mr. Moon and Mr. Wilson had to say about this, we need to have equitable access for all of our children at all of our schools. We just do. That is a fundamental thing that we as a board need to make sure that we do. So a boundary change is not what we need to be doing for equitable access. So I think perhaps I know what you were attempting here, but I think access is, because all of our children should have equitable access. So I think Mr. Wilson had used some language there that had to do with, I think, instructional impact, something along those lines.
Is our existing language.
So I think we might want to work on that a bit to have it be instructional impact or, you know, for educational excellence for all students. That might be the way to catch that. And I would just say, you know, there are a whole lot of people who aren't here tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. Mr. Moon, followed by Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the same thing, that equitable access to education opportunities first. You know, I am still not sold on that to be a trigger or reason or prompting boundary change. Maybe, you know, as you know, Ms. Evans was stating that all our students in every school deserve equally excellent programs. I think that should not be done through a boundary change. That's how I see it. Unless you tell me that, you know, this hypothetical example might qualify for the reason. So let me give you this: between school A and school B, there is no capacity problem whatsoever. Assuming that there is no capacity problem, one school has 2,000 students, and another school has 1,200 students. Obviously, school with 2,000 students can offer more classes, more options, more electives compared to 1,200. Whether shifting some students from school A to school B to balance the enrollment they will bring, I mean, that's going to have to come from boundary change. Whether that's an example potentially as a reason for boundary change, assuming that there's no capacity problem. But you know, other than that, I cannot think of any other example as equitable access to educational opportunities being the triggering point. That's question number one. I have a minute and 24 seconds. Question number two is factors. Appreciate the fact that we have come down from 16 factors to 8 factors to consider. But even among the 8 factors, they are not in a priority order. I understand that. Probably just like a school board long ago, the rest had really struggled in prioritizing those 16 factors. I don't know whether staff was equally struggling with those 8 factors. But even among those 8 factors, when the decision time comes, board may struggle or staff may struggle. Which one should be considered more important? That's first something you to think about and board to cogitate on. And number 3, the third one is a change to the student continuity. I think your recommendation is to limit that to 1 grade. Rising seniors for high school and 8th graders and 6th graders for elementary and middle school, respectively. I do not know whether I can accept that as a rule, as a policy. Until it's set in the policy, we have to just live by it. So I'm not yet ready to accept that as is.
We'll follow, Mr. Moon, excellent points, all three. We'll follow up in writing in response to the ones you have. The last one, certainly the grandfathering, it was to be in alignment with 2230 on transfer policy. If that's not in keeping with the community desire and what we've done in the past, the grandfathering clause always subject to board approval. Yeah.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Okay, Ms. Corbett Sanders, to be followed by Mr. Wilson.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. One of the challenges for many of our schools is the impact of our student transfer regulation, and that we have significant numbers of students that are attending schools outside of their boundaries. So is it how does that policy fit into best practices across the country? I would like to better understand that.
Well, again, I'm not the transfer office. Perhaps the superintendent may want to respond, but the point is, what I really suggest is the best practice is that when, across the country, when you have capacity for the transfer, for the offerings, you provide the offerings. We, in fact, do close now transfer because capacity is a variable and a factor now. But we didn't do that before, you're right.
The second piece of it is, and I agree that capacity is a critical piece, and where there is excess capacity and where there's not sufficient capacity, that's something that should trigger a review. But the next question I have is, you have transportation on there, and what's the best practice for the distance by which people travel? And also I've heard conversations about certain types of roads should not be transited because of the safety of those roads. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I've heard that in a number of our conversations regarding certain roads across the county that shouldn't have kids going across, and other roads it's fine. Like Route 1, even though it's the highest density of pedestrian deaths in the country, we have kids going across it all the time.
Yeah, we assess each and every one on an individualized basis. I don't know what the research provides. We can follow up in writing on that. I do know that we try to minimize our travel time, but when you take a look at some of the programs we offer and where students come from, some bus ridership time is really beyond what I would like to see. I wish I had more drivers and more buses to be more efficient in that regard. But it is a problem. I'll try to follow up some kind of response to that. I don't have. We have students traveling across on buses on Route 1. We try to make right turns only, if you will, on our buses. We have an excellent routing staff that are really extremely talented for the optimization of our bus routing system. We used to have a false tier. We don't have that anymore. Some of our drivers complain that they don't have enough time to use facilities, when they need to, because of the amount of time that they're pressured on their runs. And to continue that enhancement, we've been piloting Where's My Bus, the bus app that people can see on their phone. I've been pushing for that for a number of years. And just a little infomercial that we're going to be coming out with that with the DIT's help in the beginning of next school year. That should really help parents out, should they sign up for it.
And what's the best practice associated with students riding on buses that go past other schools to get to their destination? So they might start in one area and pass 2 or 3 schools that offer the same types of, or at least one other school that they'll bypass to get to the school that they're boundaried in. How often does that happen in this county? Do you know?
Off the top of my head, I don't have the exact number, but it does happen. We've had those conversations with some of the boundary adjustments that we provided recently nearby here. There were students that were driving by another middle school going to one middle school. So the board took action to try and address that, as they do. When we do take a look at these things, we try to clear up attendance islands, anomalies like that, things that have evolved over time because of growth and growing patterns and development. And as you said, a policy that hadn't been revised since 30 years.
So that does happen not only for our middle schools, it happens for some of our high schools as well. Is that correct?
I believe it happens for all of our different levels, elementary and secondary. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Wilson, followed by Mrs. Strauss.
Thank you, Ms. Hines. The first question is I think I'm going to follow up on your point, Ms. Hines. And I think that one of the reasons why I think we have a large group of folks that have come out tonight is their worry that changes may be made that affect them, that the board isn't being clear enough and transparent enough in terms of our own actions. So I think I'd like to know, and maybe Dr. Brabrand can fill this in, just so everybody knows, what are the hot spots that several board members have referred to? I'd like to know what those hot spots are specifically that the superintendent thinks we do need to, right now, to be looking at boundary changes on, if there are any. Because, I think that, sure, the capacity of the school versus the number of students in it is certainly a factor, but I'm not so sure that necessarily correlates to families and parents wanting to have their child move to a different school. So if you could just say which are those hot spots so that we know whether or not we've got issues that we need to deal with right away.
Well, we have a process each year with the CIP where we bring together, and I think it's page 36, those schools or clusters of schools that we're going to take through a boundary adjustment process. And we bring it to the board reviews it, and that's where we have the community and the board's feedback about where to move forward. We had a couple last year that we did move forward on, and that's the process that we've used to help direct staff of where to move forward. And we're doing some boundary scoping right now in Ms. Evans' magisterial district, and also in Ms. McLaughlin, who is not here tonight. So I would say to the board, we'd use the same process that we've been using through the CIP to determine what those hot spots are. And I do agree, it's not always been specific to a certain capacity limit, but as you know, in the CIP that Mr. Plattenberg and his team have presented, we can show you the percentages of where we're over or under capacity, and then use that along with what our current policy is, which is a host of factors. There's no one single factor. I do want to be absolutely clear, however, that the earlier decisions around boundaries with our expedited did not involve this entire board. I do not believe it was transparent. I'll believe that to the day I am no longer here in Fairfax County. The community needs to know when we are shifting kids and boundaries, and then to understand what that process is, whatever it is and whether everyone agrees with it or not. But we've done it with not all other board members even knowing, even when it has impacted their communities. And I'm not going to support going back to something that's not transparent.
Mr. Wilson, did you have more?
I did. Thank you. So, Dr. Brabrand, in the policy that's been proposed to the board, in paragraph 4, or section 4, it talks about reasons that may require revision. Who makes that determination, in your view, under this policy?
So, Mr. Wilson, if you go back up to section 1, the purpose to describe the authority of the Fairfax County School Board to determine the assignment of students to schools and programs. So the authority rests with the school board. We're providing for the school board in this policy reasons that may require revision of previously established school boundaries. So again, this list of A through F is for the board's consideration, for your review, for your prioritization. One of the things we did find in best practices, I mean, we have alphabet soup for factors for folks to consider. And as Mr. Moon shared at a previous work session that folks may or may not have heard, it was hard for previous boards to gather consensus on which of those factors to be prioritized. So I do think some in our community over the years tried to understand why did some things seem to move forward and some things didn't. You've got to have a clear roadmap to be able to explain. I think it's easiest to have the clearest roadmap possible. Mr. Moon honestly shared that during the time that was last looked at, that there wasn't ability to get a consensus on reducing the number of those factors, and we brought you a reduced amount. What the final number of the factors should be is for the board to decide, but I think less is more when it comes to coming up with what the policy is, so it's clear and people know the primary drivers for boundary decisions.
Okay, so then in section 6, where it says schools identified with the reason for boundary adjustments, under section 4 shall adhere to the One Fairfax policy, have a variety of elements examined. So is that the board has identified schools and then the board will examine these factors? Is that the way we're supposed to interpret this? Because I guess my feeling as one board member is I do count on you, the superintendent running the schools, to tell me where we should be looking, what is it that we see as hotspots coming around, and talk to Mr. Plattenberg to tell us where we've got capacity shortfalls, and looking at the CIP. That's why I drilled down on the question of population growth in the students, because I don't think this makes this easier for us. This may make it harder for us, because now you were talking about one board member, but now do we have to meet as a 12 to come up with the school, or is it one board member can come up with a school and bring it to the board?
Well, the overall intent of the policy is for the entire board to be reviewing boundaries. That's my belief. The board can choose not to do that. Again, I did stop moving forward on the expedited boundaries, even though it remains current policy. If I'm directed by the board to restart it, I'll do it. But I don't believe it's the right thing to do, and I don't think it's transparent. I do think Section 6 is about saying, after you've decided to initiate a boundary, what are the factors that you're going to look at? And all of these factors that we've listed all come from the educational research as something that school districts consider when they make boundary changes. So,
And I would also add that these are factors that come out of our community engagement process as well. So this isn't just, these aren't just factors that the board would consider. These are factors that come out of natural discussions with communities. So as we go out and work the scoping, as we are working with communities, these very factors can come out of those discussions and need to be brought into the discussion for the board to consider as you would think about what that boundary would look like. So it's a combination of board consideration, staff consideration, and community input as it relates to these considerations.
Okay, just lastly, in section 7, it says, and this is why this is important, because when it says when changes are required, this is the last sentence of 7. So who's making the determination that a change is required becomes critical. It says whenever a change is required, every effort shall be made to lessen the educational and social disruptions. I'm not so sure our factors that you've proposed to us accomplish that. I actually think lessening social disruption would be asking the community, do you want to have a boundary change? And then starting from there. If the community is looking for a boundary change, then, or if they're not, then you're lessening social disruptions and educational disruptions. So I think finally this sentence actually probably needs to be up in the top of our considerations.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wilson. Ms. Strauss, to be followed by Ms. Derenak Kofax.
Thank you. Yes, it has been a long time since and the last time that we made large whole-scale boundary changes when we opened Westfield. South County was a little easier because it's a more compact community. In going back, in previous boundary issues, there was a lot of concern about special education and making sure that all of our children with special needs, the assumption is they will be in their base school. Years and years ago, we were moving special education programs all the time. Very young children were being bused very, very far, and that wasn't right. So when we talk about distribution of programs and resources, every school must have a rigorous, well-rounded program of studies, and then the resources needed for those children. And some children, some schools need different help and support and more help and support. We all know that as parents and as educators. So that is simply a given. But I do think as we go forward and looking long-term at how we're going to use our facilities, it again is that commitment to our children
with disabilities, because they are in all of our neighborhoods, they are our own children, and we need to make sure that we are planning appropriately for the distribution of these programs and the space, travel times and all the rest of that. And that is, as we have brought most of our children home, that has had an impact, and we've not necessarily built sufficiently to meet that impact. But I see that as another issue in equitable distribution of programs, particularly our children with special needs. So we need to think about that.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. Ms. Derenak Kofax, to be followed by Ms. Palchik.
Yes. Ms. Schultz, you wanted to know what equity was, and I was on the committee. I'm on the skipped committee, and our entire board, I don't remember how you voted, but I do know that it was passed by the Board of Supervisors as well as our school board, and it's to have an equity lens, and equity, as we described it, was fair and just. Fair and just for all students and in our community. And so, I'm sorry, fair and just, I hear you saying you're not sure what that means, but I really think that as we go through this, and we have been told that capacity, socioeconomic balance, and travel times are the top 3 factors in consideration best practices nationwide. We weren't able to come to 3 for us, so we continue to sit on those 8 as there was a continuum of discussion over the past year. I think when we talk about things, and Mr. Plattenberg, maybe Mr. Moon was trying to get at this, but I'm not certain where he was looking at capacities. But I think there are some things which we have talked about in the past, and maybe, and I'm not sure if we're going to consider this, and Mr. Smith, maybe you're the one to address this, but how do tipping point studies impact schools and children's education to make sure it is fair and just for all? What do they look like? Maybe to the public who doesn't understand what they are, what can we do? And is that one of the factors that, and since socioeconomic balance is one of the things that best practices nationwide school communities are looking at, if you could speak to that just a bit.
So based on the research from the Office of Research and Strategic Improvement, we've noted that we see an impact on student achievement when you get to about the 40% poverty rate within schools. And so we noted that we would see an increase in scores once you were able to mitigate the poverty within schools based on current achievement of our current schools. And so as the board would want to look at poverty rates within schools and the impact of poverty on students in schools, a consideration of the right sizing could be part of the discussion. And when I say a right sizing, it's what is too much poverty? What is not enough poverty when you're thinking about that right sizing? Certainly having that conversation is important, and having that conversation with many voices at the table is important.
I agree. I think there have to be many voices, but I do think, because that balance is cited as one of the things that to be used when we look at boundaries. I do hope if this board comes to consensus as far as even going to an outside organization to help us as we go along in this process and to help us communicate with the public in a very transparent way, that will be part of the discussion, because I do think that's very important.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Palchik.
Thank you. Just a couple of things. Happy to follow my 2 previous colleagues, because first of all, when we do talk, I know we'll continue probably to have conversations about what we mean by that, if we go back to the equitable access to educational opportunities. And it is, I think there are different ways, different programs we currently students aren't able to access programs. I know now that we, like, as you said, Mr. Plattenberg, are closing IB programs because of capacity. We now have students that can no longer access them because it's just prohibitively distant and those bus times. We also, the special needs or other programs that we need in every school. I had siblings when we didn't have ESOL programs in every school who had to go long distances and be completely alienated from their community and then have to change pyramids again in order to do that. So we need to use that lens when we are looking at different programs. And sometimes, you know, it's, right now it's for us prohibitively expensive to open IB in every single school, right? So until we're able to find a way to do that in our academies, right, our academy programs. So I do think we need to maybe better define and understand what the impact is and when that would be looked at as a factor for considering a change. The other thing that I think is really important, and maybe a misunderstanding, is that our current boundaries, and we talk about it when we say alleviating attendance islands, but they're not always islands, is that I know in my district I have some boundaries that have not changed in about 60 years now, and that does have at least one community whose kids are now going to 4 different elementary schools, whose kids are living on the same block, the same street. And they said to me, I don't care which school, I just want them to be together. I want it to feel more like a community school. And we don't currently have that in every school and every community. And so I do think we have to start to figure out how to address that and how we address that in those factors. Because like I said, it doesn't fit neatly into the attendance islands. So I don't think we're 100% where we need to go. But I do think we're looking at some important changes, not to create problems, but to help to address ones that we currently have faced and haven't been fixed in the past for whatever reason. So a few more conversations, but I think we're moving in the right direction. And then just finally, to what Ms. Hines said before, I do think we're at a place where we need to address some of the immediate needs. We shouldn't rush through this policy in order to do that, but whether it's McLean, whether it's some of my other schools that are at about 120% capacity or more, we do need to figure out how we want to do that while we continue to work on this policy.
Okay, thank you. So we've been through the first go-backs. I have one board member who wants a second go-back. Is there anyone else who wants a second go-back? Okay. In the third, well, it's a second go-back, sorry. So that's all right. So we're at 10 after 9, and if we just have 2, then we can go ahead and give you 3 minutes for your second go-back, all right? Ms. Schultz, followed by Mr. Wilson.
Okay, so let me be clear. I did not vote for 1 Fairfax. If it's confusing at all, I think I'm the only person that didn't. I don't understand what fair and just is. That's the government deciding for people what is fair and just. Instead of treating people as individuals, we're treating them as one. And I don't believe that we should treat everybody the same as one. I think we should meet the unique needs of children where they are. I don't understand, and I have not gotten a question answered for I don't even know how many work sessions, that is it legal to target a child based on how much money their parents make or a parent makes, poor or rich or in between, or based on their skin color, or based on whatever other social, I don't know what the socio part is, to target them and say, we don't have enough of whatever you are and we're going to take you and target you and move you to a different school because we want some formula that is not clear or transparent at all to the public. And so we're going to decide for you based on, not on your academic needs, not on meeting your special ed needs. And I am the only person on this board who has had a child bust a great distance in preschool for special education needs because this school system has so overcrowded schools in my district, there's no room for special education projects. So when I talk about fair and just, when I say equity of a different sort, I lived it. My constituents have lived equity of a different sort. So being lectured to me about what's fair and just is not fair and just because it doesn't understand the unique needs of a child in a particular zip code. It's treating them all the same and saying, you do not get treatment or you are going to be targeted. So this is the fundamental problem, is where in this process is the role of the public to speak and say, we don't want to be treated as one. We do live in different areas. They're rich, they're unique. We have a very diverse community in Fairfax County in language and culture and background and educational background. But for the board to decide that schools are going to have a magical formula and that we're going to consider moving or busing children based on their characteristics instead of delivering to them the services that they need where they are, that should be the role of the board. So it seems like it's an inverse relationship that we're foisting onto the community the potential of moving their boundaries in order to meet their needs instead of just delivering the services to meet their needs where they are.
Okay, thank you. I now have four more people who would like go backs.
I asked a question. I keep asking
Well, I'm
questions and my
sorry. So,
questions don't
Mrs.
get
Schultz-
answered.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear a question in there. Can you try again?
I've
was
asked
your
the same question for more than a year. Is it legal to target children
I hear you.
based
So-
on their parents' bank account, their social characteristics, or the color of their skin, and decide, we get to decide what percentage makeup of each school is, and if we don't like the percentage makeup, we're going to move the children. We're either
Mrs.
going to move their
Schultz?
boundary or we're going to bust the children.
Mrs. Schultz, I hear you. So you're asking a legal question, and I think it's basically the limits of affirmative action or something like that. So I think maybe what I would suggest is that you write that question as a legal question, send it to the superintendent, and copy the chair.
I just
and
like an
then-
answer tonight.
But
I
you-
would just like an
You
answer.
asked
I've
it
asked
as
it
a legal
repeatedly.
question, and you know we get legal advice in a closed meeting. We don't get legal advice here. We don't even have our lawyer with us. So that's not an appropriate question for this meeting. Please put it in writing, and the chair will put that on our agenda for a closed meeting. Thank you. Mr. Wilson, followed by Ms. Strauss. Mr. Wilson, your clock is ticking.
Thank you, Ms. Hines. On the clock again. So let me just say at the outset that I don't think the board is anywhere close to being ready, and I would not support hiring an outside consultant to try to mask our own responsibility in fleshing out and understanding and describing to the public what this policy is going to be about. So just I don't think we should do that. I do have a question for you, Dr. Brabrand. We've heard mentioned a number of times about tipping points and the socioeconomic status of students, and we've heard that there is within the literature, within academic literature, that this maybe rebalancing of socioeconomics in a school can beneficially affect the academic achievement of students. But in Fairfax County, it seems to me, do we have any examples of that? Do we have examples of that within the DC metropolitan area? The DC schools, for example, have gentrified many neighborhoods. Have we seen where those populations have remained in place, or for example, in South Lakes High School, they did some rebounding several years ago that may have changed the socioeconomic distribution within that school. What's our own history? Is there evidence that we have that shows that weighting socioeconomic status benefits students, achievement-wise?
Well, let me say a couple of things about that. First of all, national research says that different levels of socioeconomic status can have an impact. I want you to know we have several Title I schools in Fairfax County. I just pulled recently the data of our top 10 Title I schools are performing in 85, 90 percentiles. So we are bending the curve of the research. All kids can achieve, no matter in what concentrations they exist. It's also true, And I'm not the lawyer, but I am going to tell you from the research that lots of school districts look at lots of factors to try to come up with a boundary. And the reality is in Fairfax County, community schools have been our biggest strength. It's been our biggest go-to. Several districts across the country have gone to more, who cares about where you live? Go here, go there, go to any school and figure out how you get there, or lottery programs. That's not been the Fairfax County story. It's been invested in their communities. I will say, though, it's true that some of the boundaries were based on the definition of what that community looked like with a population half the size from 35, 40 years ago, and they've never, ever been looked at again to see through all these factors how they can be designed to support student success and to support communities. So I think in the end, a boundary policy is a complex piece that has many factors. Our existing policy gives, like I said, 30 plus. I think after 30 years, it's time to refine that focus and make sure we're looking at what are our top priorities and sharing that with the community. Because we are going to continue to grow. Mr. Plattenberg said that the growth has lightened, and I think it's lightened, but let's get real. One of the largest companies on earth just parked itself 10 miles away. The Silver Line Metro is going to get completed, even though it's been delayed, which is part of the delay he's talked about. And we've got housing units that haven't been built that kids will be in and will put additional pressures on us. I mean, those are just realities. Are boundaries the only way out? No. Trailers have been a way out. Busing people to other programs that are outside of a boundary has been a way out. But I think it's responsible for a board and a community to look at all of the pieces that make up how we have kids and where kids go, and boundaries are a part of that discussion. And it's time when, as superintendent moving forward with this board and the next board that comes, I want to be part of a transparent conversation about where we are and where we want to go. And relying on something that we built 20 years ago or 30 years ago, I don't think is what best practice is for Fairfax County Public Schools. So we need to take a look at it, and that's what we've been doing.
Okay, I appreciate that answer, but I think that what I'm sensing from the community is that the community in some places is feeling like this is an exercise in a little bit of social engineering based upon the ideological background of school board members and research data that's from the educational community. And I think we just need to be straight and honest with the community. Identify those schools that we want to change the boundaries. Tell us what those schools are, so those communities can right now start galvanizing themselves if they're in favor of it or opposed to it. But let's not hide the ball. Let's not call a consultant to come in and take responsibility for decisions that we should make as a board. And let's get honest about whether or not moving kids out of their school or into a different school based on socioeconomic or racial is, if it's helpful for academics, tell us, or an achievement. If it's not, tell us that. I mean, because I think that's what the community wants to know.
Thank you. Ms. Strauss, to be followed by Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Thank you. One of the things that I think is a plus in the decisions that the Board of Supervisors made along the Silver Line and the other sort of very high-density building that is going to happen, they're also requiring the developers to do workforce housing, so that it is possible to create new urban communities where people can live, work, play, and eventually go to school in their own community. Workforce housing at Tyson's has so far we only have 37 children, but we are hoping that some of our teachers can take advantage of that, and that is certainly not targeting teachers of a certain income who might wish to live closer to their schools where they're teaching. I don't see this, I certainly am not looking for social reengineering or cross-busing or segregation, resegregation, any of those things. I would rather look at it in the breach. It is illegal to resegregate schools. Thank you very much. But I think it is more reasonable to make sure that we provide the resources needed, and as Dr. Brabrand said, community school
is really our model. For the last 30, 40 years, we've discussed this over and over and over. A community school is what, every time we've had boundary discussions, that is where the community comes down, and various school boards have backed into that again. But it is good programs for all children in all schools, and reasonable adjustments. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Corbett Sanders, followed by Mr. Moon and Ms. Keys Gamara.
Thank you. I just want to first talk a little bit about the tone and tenor. In the past few minutes, we've heard about hiding the ball, that we have a hidden agenda, that we aren't being forthcoming, and that is blatantly not true. And as much as I respect you, Mr. Wilson, I want to make it very clear. There is not a single boundary that anybody on this board has predetermined or is even talking about in the context of this policy. It is more a focus on what is responsible, good governance and policy making. That's the first thing. The second thing, when we talk about community schools, which every member of this board has been supportive of, we've actually opened 2 community schools or provided wraparound services at 2 schools in the county and called them community schools. Except one of them is a bit of an oxymoron, because that school has 100% of its students bused to it. That school is located in a community in which not a single child lives in walking distance to that school. We have a challenge in this county on our boundary policy. So I agree that we should be focusing on community schools and doing whatever we can to ensure that we have strong community schools. But those strong community schools are a right for every community. And so this policy is not about predetermining or defining somebody's boundaries. It has nothing to do with that. I was quite surprised when people came to us and said, oh, you are going to change this boundary or that boundary. And every time someone's asked it, I've said, I didn't know that, because unless there are some sidebar conversations which have predetermined those boundaries, then and they're not happening in a public manner, they certainly aren't happening with this board member. And so when we go around and we make inflammatory statements about what people are doing, then all we are doing is creating a false narrative that is unacceptable and unbecoming a public servant.
Okay, thank you. I have Mr. Moon and Ms. Keys Gamara, and then I'm going to try to get to next steps because it's almost 9:30.
Just to make sure that I'm understanding this clearly, what you have brought to us is your best work for board's consideration. Board can do whatever it wants to do. Correct?
It's always the case, Mr. Moon.
Always the case. So what I see on page 5 is, what I see on page 5, Mr. Plattenberg? What I see on page 5 is the steps recommendations for the boards to consider as reasons that trigger potential boundary change. And what I see on page 6, the next page, are the factors once the board accepts that there is a triggering reason to cause a potential boundary change. On page 6 are the factors that you are recommending board to consider. Correct?
That is correct.
And so now going back to page number 5, do I see any wealth as a triggering reason for a boundary change?
No, sir, you're correct.
Do I see any race,
No, sir.
ethnic background,
No, sir.
any particular family situation
No, sir.
as a reason for boundary change?
No, sir.
On page 6, on the next page, the only busing that I see is a busing route as a factor to consider. what is busing routes?
We take a look at the busing routes of efficiency, the proximity, for the reduction of travel time for students.
So when people normally talk about busing students, it gives an impression that we are taking students from one end of county, sending to the other end of the county. That's not what you are recommending us to consider as a factor.
No, these considerations, and that's why they include the operational efficiency as well. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to make that clear for my colleagues and for the public who may be watching us as well.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. Ms. Keys-Gamarra, followed by Mr. McElveen.
I'm actually very happy to follow Mr. Moon because I believe you were zeroing in on the language that's very concerning to me as well. Language is extremely important, especially when you're talking about policy and you're impacting how a community feels about its government. And I agree with Ms. Corbett-Sanders that we've heard some inflammatory language today, and so it is important that we correct exactly what we're talking about. And Mr. Moon just pointed that out. On page 5, the way that we identify reasons to require a revision of our boundaries has nothing to do with socioeconomic status or race or any of the things that we heard earlier. That is extremely important because we are not, this board and this staff is not even recommending that that is a reason to start looking at a school. We are not targeting children in any way. So that is extremely important. Second of all, when you get to the considerations, that is when those other issues come up. And Dr. Brabrand, I am familiar with the research that you're referring to that suggests that those can be considerations, but it is only after you've looked at those things listed on page 5. And so I am very concerned about some of the information that I've received walking into this meeting. I've been very concerned about the tenor and the level of anger that people have felt, and I know it's because of the information that people have received in the community. And so we have to talk about the facts. And I wanted to point this out because I know even as I walked in here, I walked with a lady and her daughter, and I said, "Are you coming to our meeting?" And she started talking about how people are mentioning tweets of people what board members have said. We are a 12-member board. We make decisions together, and I commend you, Dr. Brabrand, for bringing this to this board and making sure that we hold our feet to the fire and we discuss it in a transparent manner. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well, that is it for Go Back. So thank you, everybody, very much. Do we have any next steps that we need to discuss? So it's just 29 and 30? Well, let's see. All right, so 29 on slide 4, list the factors according to degree of impact on equity. Let's get some answers to that. Is that the question you're asking?
Yeah, it's the same question that I had sent to the superintendent and Mr. Plattenberg before.
Okay.
It's,
I think, for the public, 1 through 28 are next steps from our previous conversations, and I think we have had answers to almost all of those at this point. We don't have 30 for tonight, Dr.
So, yeah, I
Brabrand.
think, that captures what I'm looking for, and I did want clarity on achievement impacting excellence.
Got it, it's a little confusing. Number 30, publish a report of our boundary conversation since October 18 and include a history of sort of how we got here. That is what I was looking for, thank you. Mrs. Schultz, did you have a go back?
Yeah, I had two. One was the legality of, and I'm sorry, everybody's sleight of hand, everybody's talking about section 4, which is what schools. Number 6 is how you go about it. So the section 6 says that the schools identified with a reason for a boundary adjustment of this policy shall, adhering to the one Fairfax policy, have a variety of elements examined when establishing a new school boundary, including. So that is the targeting. So I don't know why I'm surprised all of my colleagues seem to go from stop at 4 instead of go on to 6.
So could we make sure that we have your?
The legality of section 6 in targeting certain populations in the consideration of how we would draw a new boundary.
Let's not, we're not
Well,
targeting, we're not
well,
targeting.
well,
That's
that's-
not a fair question.
Well,
But how about you do this?
You can choose your words. How about I get to choose my words?
Well, we all decide whether this is a follow-up
You
question.
can change, you can vote down my next step and supplant it with your own next step, but I see section 6 specifically saying that you are going to examine them establishing based on socioeconomic. I don't know what that means other than
I'm
targeting.
sorry, I'm just trying to be clear about what you're at. So the legality of section 6, bullet 1, which is
Well-
socioeconomic and or racial, just so that,
Yeah,
so that
yes.
our
It's
lawyer
actually
knows what you're
6A.
asking.
It's 6A.
6A, okay.
6A. It
6A,
is accurate.
okay, thank you.
And then the necessity of discussing this as a boundary-wide, a county-wide boundary study, this is a second,
Okay,
sorry. The necessity of discussing county-wide boundary changes rather than assessing where we're having issues and providing solutions to existing, and I would say prescient, pressing problems now, rather than continuing to wait to solve something at a county-wide problem.
Okay, so
There
you're
are urgent
asking-
issues that need to be solved now.
You're asking why we're talking about the policy before, the necessity of discussing countywide boundary changes rather than
Of
assessing.
pushing off any boundary decisions until this behemoth, whenever this is,
all right.
gets done.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have next steps? Ms. Darren Kofax?
I think several of us talked about the possibility of hiring an outside consultant.
Oh, yes. How about we will direct the superintendent to bring back to the board a proposal to hire an outside consultant to help the board implement our boundary policy.
Can that include the community engagement portion?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yes.
Direct superintendent, bring back to board proposal to hire an outside consultant, to implement.
To study.
To facilitate to facilitate community engagement on our boundary policy? Yes. Okay, let's do that, on our boundary policy. Okey doke. Anything else? Yes, Ms. Evans?
Since we're doing 31, I'd also like to ask for the legality of resegregating students according to race and socioeconomics.
Okay.
I have no problem with you including that in the same one.
Ms. Evans, do you want that included in the same one? So you don't care?
It's a separate question.
Okay, sorry, Madam Clerk, that's a separate question. Okay, hang on one sec. All right, Ms. Corbett Sanders.
I thought we were asking the superintendent to provide us a list with of the hotspots and a prioritization of how to address, those hotspots.
According to the current policy, because we are still doing boundary changes as we speak.
Right. What I'm particularly questioning is that we had a preliminary discussion about McLean, but we didn't
Exactly.
actually include it in our CIP, which is why there has been a challenge because it wasn't added into the CIP, and should that be identified as a hotspot that
Thank you.
requires?
Thank you, I
Mr.
appreciate it.
Dr. Brabrand, do you understand the question? Okay, Ms. Palchik?
Yes, I don't know if we covered this or if it's next step, but I heard a few of my colleagues mention removing or looking at the regulation for grandfathering, or removing that from the policy back into the regulations. I don't know if we want to maybe just review the grandfathering proposed in the policy.
Well, is staff going to review that, or are we?
Okay, well, at some point.
I think we
Okay.
have to review
Okay.
it, so I don't know.
Are
that
we going to
it's-
vote on these?
I don't know that we're asking staff to do that. Okay, we're getting, again, quite a few. Let's make sure that we're asking questions that staff can actually help us with, right? Ms. Corbett Sanders, do you have another one?
Yes, and I think we've talked about it numerous times, do we need to review the pupil placement policy?
So is that a next step for this, or
Well,
is that
but
something?
I think it has an impact on our capacity in our schools.
All right, well, let's be clear, though. Are we directing the superintendent to come back to the board, or are we saying we want to put this on for a work session?
So the superintendent, we have talked about this in a number of these sessions discussing boundary policy, and the superintendent has indicated that our current pupil placement policy does have an impact on the capacity in individual schools. So I guess the question would be, do we need to review that pupil placement policy in light of what we're discussing in boundaries?
And I guess the only reason that I'm pushing back a little bit is that I'm not sure that we had that on our agenda for tonight to talk about whether or not we were going to reconsider that. So what I would suggest, since you're the chair, if you want to put it on for a work session at some point in the future to get, because I know for myself as a board member, I would need some background.
So could
on what
we
it
actually
is.
get consensus that this would be the subject of a future work session? Because the board
Okay,
chair
so
does
sense
not
of the
just
board?
put things
Yeah.
on the agenda for the
That
chair's
seems
sake.
like a forum topic to me, not a next step discussion.
Well, I hear you, but we hardly ever get to the forum, so this is an opportunity, if the board is ready, to put your hand up and say yes. But how many can I see a show of hands?
I don't think
On
we ought to be
whether-
changing.
well, we should go through all of
I don't
them.
think we should be changing our governance at the table ad
37.
hoc.
We're
We
not
have
changing
we have
our
a process.
governance.
Schedule a future work session on pupil placement policy in light of boundary discussions. Raise your hand if you are now, as a board member, ready to say, yes, let's put that on a future work session.
Just number 37?
Just
or
number
are you
37,
voting-
just number 37. And then
And
we'll
we'll
go
work
back up, and
upwards.
we'll work back up.
Okay. So is number
Hands,
37?
can we have hands up, and I'm going to count them, and if it's not enough, then we'll have to do it a different way. 1, 2,
Look at our
3,
people.
4. Okay, you have to
Okay,
do it a different
that's
way.
okay.
Please take that off, number 37, thank you. 36, review grandfathering proposed in the policy. Ms. Palchik, you mean the board should do that?
I heard from a few of my colleagues, and since staff has been giving recommendations on the policy, it was just, is a recommendation for, removing that from, it sounded like the policy and having it be more of a regulation, but. I may
Okay,
have
oh,
misunderstood.
so your suggestion is take it out of the policy and put it in the regulation. Ms. Strauss, did you have something?
This is often of great interest to the community when there is an active boundary discussion with the community. I am a little uncomfortable with making that too tight in the policy. 'cause
That's what
these-
I mean. It's
yeah,
tight
and-
right now.
Yeah, and I would agree with you,
Right,
because
okay.
these are things that
Right.
communities feel pretty strongly about, and unless you've got a huge emergency, we have to balance it.
I
But if
agree.
it goes into
Mr.
the
Moon?
regulation, we won't have any control over it and won't be public.
Right, so Mr. Moon, what do you?
Yeah, my take on this is, staff has provided us with a recommendation.
Right.
Board disagrees, we can change it.
So maybe we could send a message to staff that the board would like some alternative recommendations for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and perhaps those, I know Mr. Moon brought it up, I can't remember who the other board member was, if you'd like to work with staff for alternative recommendations, okay.
Okay, thank you. Number 35, superintendent to provide a list of hotspots and prioritization of those spots. So that would be maybe reminding us of what's in the CIP and anything else that has been hanging fire for a while. Oh, is that, do we, yeah.
I have a question regarding that, if I may ask. Would that, because I know that there are board members that have mentioned things to me that are not listed in the CIP, so how would we address that? I'm thinking that this is an opportunity for folks to carry their concerns to the superintendent, and then we have it brought in front of all of us.
Okay.
If I may, it sounded to me like there's been, since I've been on the board, some confusion as to how that works, so the process. So I don't know if we just want to clarify the process for addressing this. I don't know what you were going to say, Dr. Brabrand.
I was just going to take what Ms. Keys-Gamarra just said. I mean, I'm taking this, that if you have specifics, that you will share them with me, and then I'd bring that list in front of the whole board, and you can decide whether to use that list for the current ongoing policy that we have, or to wait for revisions to the new policy before implementing, or some combination of either or, depending on how hot the hot spot is.
My point in bringing that, adding that language is to, so that we are publicly stating that we're bringing that information through you, and then the board will have discussions about it. Because as of now, there are some things that I have heard about as an at-large member that are not included in the CIP.
Can I ask the definition of a hotspot? Are you talking about student population, just overcrowding? Because, is program dearth, access to program a hotspot? Or is 40 square miles of Fairfax County not having a school with the closure of Clifton? I have no school. I have no middle, no high school, no elementary school in 40 square miles. So is that a hotspot? I mean, what's the definition of a hotspot?
So I would just tell you how I interpret this. You'll tell me what's a hotspot, right? I'll bring the list. I'll let you review it, and then you can determine what ones you want to move forward on or not based on your feeling of that, instead of trying to make a new reg or policy right here at the table at 9:40 at night. If you think it's a hotspot, staff may come back with as this language states right now, a prioritization of those hotspots. And we can give our reasons why, our rationale for that. But if you bring me one, I don't think I'm gonna, I think the rules of the game here, if you bring it to me, I'm gonna include it on the list. It may be not first on the list, but I will bring it on the list, and then you all can decide which ones we wanna wrap into our normal CIP annual process that will come in this fall around boundary adjustments.
Okay, given that clarity, who's okay with number 35? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that passes. 34, direct superintendent to bring back to board the proposal to hire an outside consultant to facilitate community engagement on our boundary policy. Everybody okay with that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep, that passes. Number 33, the necessity of discussing countywide boundary changes rather than assessing where we are having issues. So you're asking for guidance from the superintendent on that?
The next step is, why are we going to continue, waiting until this eventually gets passed without solving current problems? Or are we going to have a portion of this policy that is going to be developed that doesn't currently exist? I'm talking about what's not here, which is we need rapid solving of problems now, not a countywide boundary study. How are we going to solve emergent problems?
That sounds like advocacy and not really a question, but anyway, if staff has anything that they can add to enlighten us on that, why don't we,
We'll review all these and come back at an earlier hour, but I don't have a problem with, I understand the spirit of 33, and we'll have staff review that.
all right, number 31 and 32, questions for our lawyers, raise your hand if you
So,
can support.
hang on a second.
Oh, go ahead.
On
I'm sorry.
32, I think it should be changed to resegregating students by race and socioeconomics, just by, yeah.
Asking questions of our lawyers, 31 and 32. Is everyone okay with that? Okay, 32, legality of resegregating students by race and socioeconomics. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that passes. 31, legality of Section 6A and targeting certain populations.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
I can't vote for anything that says we're targeting students, certain populations, because I don't believe that we are.
Yeah.
So if Ms. Schultz insists upon that language, I can't support it.
So what newspeak would you like me to use? Because if the word targeting is offensive, what, identifying, it's the exact same thing. It's the exact same thing. It's the exact same thing. If you want to move it to identify, then we can change it. But we're playing word games.
I think the language is misleading, so I just won't support it.
Ms. Hines, may I suggest just simply leave it as the legality of Section 6A?
Ms. Schultz, can you live with that? Because
That's fine, but I think it's very clear to the public what we're doing. We're taking words that the board deems offensive, but it's actually the action is what's
There's a
offensive,
difference
not the
between
words.
offensive and inaccurate.
We disagree, Mrs. Schultz.
Your
but-
board has not decided whether it was offensive. We're just asking a legal question, right?
Right, we're
Okay.
asking
That's
a
fine.
legal
We can play the
question.
game.
All
I'm
right, number
fine.
31, as it's written, who can support that? That we get a legal opinion on 6A? Can't hurt, right? Okay, that passes. 30, published report of our boundary conversation since October 18, include a history of kind of how we got here. And this just putting in one place all the background information. Okay.
Are
thank
you talking about like a separate website that?
Oh,
that-
no, I was thinking more of, we'd have to figure out how to push it out to the community.
I
but-
think it's a good idea, like, we have the CIP in one place, and when we do certain things, like the Jeb Stewart name change, we put everything on one website page so that people could, at one landing page. I think that's actually a
Okay.
very good idea to enhance the
So
transparency on
I
this.
interpreted this, that this was both board and community ability. Let us leave it a little flexible for us to go
Good.
figure out the right way.
Communications will figure that out. Thank you. All right, 29 on slide 4, list of factors according to degree of impact on equity. Yes, this is Ms. Evans' question. I agree. We need clarity about that. Everybody support number 29?
Ms. Evans, could I ask one question, though? On slide number 4 is not something staff is recommending at this point in time. Those are from our prior discussion, those 8 factors, right? And what they're recommending is on page number 6.
Well, but okay, let me call it up.
Are you just asking for that to be force ranked on slide 4?
Yeah, I'm asking for information about what they put on slide 4, and I'm asking them to rank the impact.
Okay, but that's not what they're recommending to us.
But-
It's from
but
the prior study.
That's fine, I still.
You still want the
Yes.
information, okay?
Yeah, this is background research. It's not a
okay.
recommended list, but it's background research, and I think we just want a little more clarity. Maybe
Then that,
pull the details from the
Understood.
Orsi report. Okay.
Before I vote for it, I just want to understand, are you trying to ask staff that the list of 8 things on slide 4 be force ranked in the order of magnitude of impact? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I wouldn't have called it force ranked, I just want them to rank it. I want them to tell me what's the greatest impact, what's the second greatest, what's the third greatest, according to the research, what the research shows. And then I want clarity on the achievement piece.
Right. So all I would just say on this, we'll go back and look and see what the research says. If there's a ranking provided in the research, we'll provide it. And the bigger part of what I thought your question was the word achievement, which was number 8, and the issue of how's achievement relate to excellence. It felt like it was circular. So we'll go back and clarify that.
Ms. Darren Kofax?
Well, even though we use different words, I mean, they already talked about it. They did talk, that it was capacity, socioeconomic balance, and travel time. I think we're using different words in slide 4, but that's what you said the national best practices was.
Maybe we just
But
need
you wanna
clarity.
formalize it,
Yeah,
that's
and about
fine.
how this slide relates to what we're.
That's fine, yeah.
What has been
We'll
recommended.
get the information. I do want to clarify, I think what Ms. Hines just said. This slide 4 didn't come into the proposed regulation that we wrote, but it was research, and it's a slide that's left you with more questions than clarity, so we want to clarify that slide, and we'll work to do that in the next
And
step.
if we can use the same language
Okay.
throughout, when we talk about it throughout, I think that's important because,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all. It's always challenging. We are adjourned.
No, we are not adjourned, but thank you.
Sorry. Madam Chair?
The board will now make a motion to go into closed meeting to consult with legal counsel regarding litigation and specific legal matters requiring the provision of legal advice by such counsel pursuant to Section 2.2, 3711A7 and A8 of the Code of Virginia, specifically special education matters and Doe versus School Board Case Number 119 CV 00917. Do I have a motion? Motion made by Ms. Keys-Gamarra, seconded by Mr. McElveen. All those in favor? That is unanimous. We are now in closed session.